Hi, I'm Joel with Madison Creations. A friend of mine commissioned me to design and build a vinyl album stand that he could use in his music room. He has a collection of 250 to 300 vinyl albums, but they're literally stacked in milk crates on his floor right now, so he asked me to come up with a more attractive solution. This was a really fun project, although it did come with quite a few challenges. Please join me as I walk you through the build. Here you can see my basic SketchUp design. The stand is made of solid ash base and an ash plywood top case. It is just over 44 inches wide, 24 inches deep, and stands 46 inches tall. We added a shelf to the bottom, and as you can see, there are 6 separate compartments on the top case to store the albums. The back row is elevated to give the albums more visual appeal, and the back has a slot cut into the top so the albums being listened to can be displayed. I'll hide the sides so you can see the internal design just to help you get an idea of how this project will come together. We have the front, center divider, back shelf, shelf support, and the album dividers. So that's just a quick overview of how this is going to come together, and let's get to the build. This project is made out of solid ash and ash plywood. I started with these massive 2-inch thick boards that were about 11 inches wide and 10 feet long. And due to the COVID pandemic, this was the first time I was not allowed into my hardwood supplier to pick out my own boards. So I made sure I ordered a little extra so I could plan around any defects. First order of business was to break down everything into more manageable parts, the miter saw, and then using the standard roughing process I would move on to the table saw. So next, the table saw took on all these parts to get them closer to final dimension. Here I'm roughing out the 4 legs, the 4 top aprons, 4 lower stretchers that will not only strengthen the case, but they hold that shelf I pointed out earlier. And to save time at the planer, I went to the bandsaw to reduce the thickness of these pieces to about 1/8 of an inch over their final thickness. For example, these aprons' final thickness is 1 1/4 inches. I should point out that although I ordered rough lumber, they surfaced both faces at my lumber dealer, so I was able to now go right to the joiner, get 2 sides perfectly square, and then it's off to the planer to get everything to final thickness. I don't like having to mess with the tape measure every time my boards come out of the planer, so I just stack my Rockler brass setup bars to the appropriate thickness, and every time I lay a board next to them I can see how close I am to that final dimension. And then the last step is to go back to the miter saw to get all of these parts down to their final length. Here's a quick shot of the lower base all assembled, just so you can get an idea of what we're working towards. This is a good time to mention, I've been doing woodworking as a hobbyist and side business for over 20 years. I may be using some tools such as this Festool domino that you may not have access to if you're just starting out. As a woodworker, you know there are many ways to accomplish almost any task in the shop. I'm going to explain how I did it for this project, but if you have questions about alternate methods that could be used for any process, just reach out to me, leave a comment below, and I'll be happy to present other solutions for you. I want to point out that I'm using the Domino XL or the DF700. There is a smaller one that is the DF500. The main difference is the size of the cutter and therefore the size of the mortise that these tools can cut. I purchased a larger domino for 2 reasons. I need to cut larger mortises for bigger projects such as barn doors and a gate I have planned. You can get an adapter for this XL that will allow you to use all the smaller cutters normally used in the DF500. So although the XL is heavier and a little bulkier, I personally feel it's more versatile. Here's that adapter that's available from Seneca Woodworking. And now I'm going to work on all the mortises in all 4 aprons as well as the legs. I also want to mention any tools I use in this video I purchase with my own money. I use them because I like them and they work well for me. This video is not sponsored by any company. I just realized something interesting. These tenons are probably going to intersect, which is not a big deal. I'm just going to have to come up with a plan to trim one side down just a fraction. But that's all right. Hey everyone, so I wanted to share real quick the mistake I made in the design of my legs and rails and what I'm going to do to fix it. As you saw earlier, I was cutting the mortises with a domino on the inside faces of each leg for the top rail. When doing so, I realized I had made an error in my design, and these are 50 millimeter in length dominoes that go in here. And they are too close to each other. So basically, when I cut these 2 mortises and then cut these, I was actually cutting into this mortise area. Essentially what this means is, when I put this domino in, you can see right here, I think, yes, it seats fully. However, it will not allow this domino to now seat fully. So, what I'm going to do, I'm not too worried about it, very hard wood. Still plenty of glue surface. I over-engineered this when I designed it anyway. What I'm going to do is, on each leg, I want to make sure there's a fully seated domino in this direction and a fully seated domino in this direction. And then these, each leg will also have one where I have to trim. It looks like about 10 millimeters off of there. So I'm not worried about it at all. It's going to be super strong, plenty of glue area. I think that's the best fix for it. I actually opted not to put into my planning where I was going to put the dominoes. I just thought, I know it's going to be domino, mortise and tenon joinery. I don't need to take the time in SketchUp to locate each domino. And that's a mistake. So lesson learned. Next time I will be taking the time to actually lay out where each domino is cut. But this will be fine. Let's get back to it. So here I want you to really pay attention. After discovering my minor mistake with the mortise layout, I think I was feeling frustrated and I was looking for a quick way to solve the problem. My initial thought was trim those dominoes on the table saw, and as you can see, I was not set up to hold it properly. Right there, my woodworking instinct should have kicked in, but I ignored them, and, well, this happened. I don't think that's a good idea. Plan B, go to the bandsaw. Now, the domino was the only thing injured in this situation, but it was clearly stupid. Fortunately, I almost always keep myself out of the line of the blade in case this happens. Had it come toward me, I did have all my safety equipment on, but all I can say is wear your safety glasses, kids. Cutting these on the bandsaw, what a great idea. Here I am, back to mortising the lower stretchers as well as all 4 legs. I took my time to triple check and make sure I was making all the mortises in the correct location on all 4 faces. And next I cut a groove in the top apron pieces as well as the lower stretchers to hold table clips, which will be used to attach the top case to the lower frame as well as the lower shelf to the stretchers. Next step was to use my Rockler taper jig to taper the 2 inside faces of each leg. You can see a light burning on these faces as I cut them. I realized after the fact that my taper jig had a very small amount of play in it within the miter slot of my table saw. This is an adjustable feature of the jig. I just did not have it dialed in properly, and I thought I did. Certainly wasn't a big deal. It all sanded out very easily. I spared you video of me sanding relentlessly, but all parts were sanded prior to this glue up. I used 180 grit on everything, and we'll do a final sanding once it's assembled. I just prefer to do as much as I can ahead of time. So for this first glue up, I'm using Type Bond 3 glue. I use that pretty much for everything just because I always have it in my shop. The open time for this glue is not very long, so these small components, sub-assemblies, is the only place I'm going to use this Type Bond. Once that has had a chance to dry, I think I'll let this dry overnight. From then on, you see me using epoxy to do all my glue ups. And I specifically got a West Systems epoxy that had a very long open time. As you'll see, it was very important to me later on when I started cutting all these dominoes and trying to get the plywood case glued up. But here I'm just joining the sub-assemblies, so I'll have one full bottom case. Here I am just making sure everything is square. I did off camera a very long and tedious dry run of this to make sure everything did fit together properly. So now I'm just getting everything squared up, clamped up, and it'll sit overnight. Alright, now I'm moving on to the next phase of the build. I've got 2 sheets of 3/4 inch ash plywood. I'm just using my track saw to break it down. My camera got a little out of control on me here, so I'm not going to drive you crazy with that picture. Now with all my plywood pieces cut to rough dimensions, I take them to my Festool MFT3 table, which you've seen me use frequently throughout this video. This thing is fantastic at cutting material perfectly square and with accurate and repeatable cuts. Once I have the stop set in the right position, it's just a matter of putting one side against the fence, cutting the board square with the track saw, flipping the board over, keeping the same side against the fence, but putting it up against the stop and squaring the other end. Now every piece will be exactly the same length. Mortises are now cut around the entire bottom of the case. How many dominoes are too many? Well, I don't know, but I do think I might have pushed the limit. I should be clear, I intentionally planned on using the domino as my primary joinery method on this project. Honestly, I had not used this tool very often, and I thought this would be a great project to get some practice with it. I'm sure cutting dados and grooves would have been the most practical solution to this build, but let's be honest, what fun is that? My decision to use so many dominoes did cause me some stress and headaches, but I'm happy to say in the end, everything came together perfectly. Flipping that board over like that was actually a huge mistake, and I'm going to explain that here in just a second. This long pause here on my part is where I realized I just made that mistake of flipping the board over. Once I had processed it, I realized there wasn't much I could do, so I just kept cutting the mortises. Okay, I just did something really dumb, and at the same time, I got really lucky. As you may have noticed earlier, what I did was cut all my mortises with the domino, referencing a face, and then flipped the board over. So I referenced the top of this piece on one side, and I referenced the bottom on the other side. I cut all the mortises on one side, referencing, we'll call it the top. What I should have done is flip this around, cut all my mortises on the other side, so I'm always referencing the same side against this fence. What I did is I cut them all on this side, flipped it over, and cut them all on this side. Now here's where the luck comes in. If you could take a look at these, they are perfectly in the center. I actually took the domino, referenced it on a face, slid the bit in, it fit fine. I then flipped the board over, referenced the other face, took the domino, slid the bit or the cutter in, and it literally is perfectly in the center. It's rare, but sometimes you get very lucky. So I'm pressing on as if that stupid error didn't happen, and I'll make sure I think about that more every time I'm cutting. I'm sure by now you've seen me cut enough mortises with this domino. You can see I've completed all the mortises around the case bottom, and now I am mortising for the center divider. So let's shift gears for a minute and talk about edge banding the plywood. The edges of the plywood are just plain ugly. That is one of the many reasons I don't really enjoy working with plywood. To make it look better, I applied edge banding anywhere the edge of the plywood would be visible. This comes in a large roll with heat-activated adhesive applied to the back of it. Simply trim it to size, use a hot iron to activate the adhesive, and then I use a special trimming tool designed specifically for trimming the edge banding. It makes the process so much faster. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to do a separate detailed video on this process. And here you can see just how good the ash edge banding matches the rest of the plywood face. When designing this piece, one thing that haunted me was the assembly process. It is something you really need to take into consideration when you aren't using pre-made plans that come with step-by-step instructions. I wanted to avoid using pocket screws if at all possible. I did not want to use wood filler to fill a bunch of screw holes knowing I was going to stain this piece. I finally settled on building this from the inside out, starting with the center divider and, of course, using the dominoes. I use my woodpecker's clamping squares here to keep things at right angles. One of the few exceptions to my rule of not using screws on this project were these two front album dividers. I attached them with screws from underneath the case bottom as well as through the back of the center divider. All these will be completely invisible once the case is assembled. Here you can see how the screws in the center divider will be hidden once that back shelf is installed. To help keep you oriented, I'm currently working on the rear album shelf and shelf support. The shelf support was also screwed through the bottom as there was no need to use dominoes for this piece. I realized I could not only glue but also screw the back shelf to the shelf support and carefully located the screws directly underneath the rear album dividers. These then completely covered up the screws. And as you can see here, I did go back to the domino to put a couple of mortise and tenons into the rear album dividers. Although I was able to use my Festool 90-degree driver attachment on my drill to get a couple screws into the bottom of these dividers, I thought it was best for strength and alignment to add a couple dominoes. Now I'm laying out the cut line for the angled cut on the sides. Once I confirmed the line was exactly where I wanted it, I used my track saw to cut both pieces at once to ensure they were identical. Perfect. About 2 inches here, goes down. I was trying to leave about a 1/4 inch there. Both side pieces get some edge banding before I start cutting more mortises with the domino. There's an end in sight for this domino madness. I continued the case glue up by adding the front and back and then letting that epoxy cure overnight. The next morning I did a dry fit of the sides, and as you can hear, I could not contain my excitement when it all came together. Yes! I then attached both sides with epoxy and again let it cure overnight. So by now you have to be wondering, just how many dominoes went into this project anyway? Well, too many, I guess, is the simple answer, but I believe the final breakdown was 24 dominoes in the lower base, and a whopping 94, I believe, were used in the upper plywood case. So that's giving me a grand total of 118 dominoes in just this one project. I completely agree that is a bit ridiculous and likely will never happen again. Now I just had to cut the corners out of the bottom shelf so they could fit around the legs, ensure the fit was good, and of course this shelf got some edge banding. This project is almost ready for finish. I decided I need to add a small piece of trim to help with the visual transition from the top case to the lower base. I cut a 45-degree angle off each corner of a block of ash and then ripped 2 pieces to 3/8 of an inch. I then ripped them again to 3/8 of an inch, leaving me with a simple piece of trim that was then attached to the plywood case. I again spared you video of me sanding, but I worked my way through all the grits, ending with a final sanding of 180 grit. I had some concerns about the ash plywood staining evenly, and with the color matching the solid hardwood. I did many tests and determined that it was best for me to seal everything with a very thin cut of shellac. I just used store-bought de-wax shellac, cut it 50-50 with alcohol, and applied it to the entire piece. This helped even out the colors, and although it did not completely prevent blotching in the plywood, it certainly helped. I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of staining wood, but sometimes it just has to be done, and in this case, I was meeting the client's request, and we all know the customer is always right. I used General Finishes gel stain. I believe it was antique walnut for the color. As I mentioned earlier, I did get a little blotchiness when I applied this to the plywood. Fortunately, the parts were on the inside of the case, and that would not be visible once this thing was loaded up with albums. While staining the lower base, I almost got myself into trouble because I stained too large of an area without wiping off excess, and it started to get tacky on me. So for the plywood case, I worked in smaller areas, staining one section at a time. For the top coat, I used Osmo's Pollux oil. This is a blend of oil and hard wax and is durable enough for hardwood floors. I took a test piece that I had stained and applied 2 coats of Pollux oil to it. I dripped some water on it thinking it may still soak into the pores of this open-pored ash, but it was a pleasant surprise to see how the water beat it up. I actually left the water on the piece of wood until it dried, and it didn't damage the wood at all. Applying the Pollux oil is very easy. I just use these white 3M pads and put on a very thin coat. Some people leave it as is to dry. I opted to wipe off the excess after it sat for about 10 minutes. I let it dry overnight and applied a second coat in the same way. Here you can see that blotchiness, especially on the inside of the back piece. I tried twice to sand out and restain it, but I feared I would sand through the veneer layer on the plywood if I tried to fix it anymore. I decided because it would be hidden when the albums were in place, I would just leave it alone. After everything was dry and I did a final test fit, I secured the top case and the lower shelf with the metal table clips, and I set up a delivery date. My friend was very happy with this album stand. He actually asked me to design and build him another piece for the rest of his music equipment before I had even left his house. Thanks for hanging out with me, and remember to hit the subscribe button to be alerted when that and any other videos come out. Now get out in the shop and get creative.